Welcome back to Innistrad, the plane where every time you think things might get better, they don't. We've been waiting for you. And please, shut the door behind you. There's a draft. Per usual for Innistrad sets, the allied color pairs focus on spirits, zombies, vampires, werewolves, and humans. However, in this set, the archetypes for these color pairs are less focused on the creature type and more focused on a mechanical theme that those creatures have in common. Disturb is a new mechanic focused in white-blue that allows you to cast a creature card from your graveyard transformed. Every disturbed card in this set becomes a spirit with flying, and they all exile themselves if they would enter a graveyard, so you can't just keep disturbing them. You might find yourself inexplicably drawn to this archetype if you have Patrician Geist, Phantom Carriage, Ominous Roost, or Denic, but you don't need any of them. Flyers is a strong theme by itself, so feel free to start picking these up if you're seeing a lot of disturbing sights. Cards. As with any flying deck, you want to start by gumming up the ground. Flyers have worse stats than their non-flying counterparts, so if you're just racing your opponent's ground creatures, you're going to lose. The nice thing about this is that most of your flyers start out as ground creatures, so you can trade off with things like Morning Patrol, Malevolent Hermit, or Devoted Graphkeeper, then get another body out of the deal to start swinging back. Beloved Beggar holds the ground in the early game, and is the biggest spirit you can disturb in the late game. Gale Drifter is 2 flyers in 1. Covetous Castaway can mill your disturb cards to bypass the first half of the creature, and if that's something you're interested in, there's plenty more where that came from. Overwhelmed Archivist and Shipwreck Sifter are notable for letting you discard spirits, which pumps the Sifter into a cheap ground blocker or threat. Once you've got your disturbed creatures, you can look toward Gavany Silversmith and Odric's Outrider to make your flyers bigger threats while holding the ground. Candletrap is excellent removal for ground creatures that you're not quite able to block. Geistwave and Fading Hope can mess with opposing blockers, or can bounce your spirits in a pinch to restart the disturb cycle. But we're not done yet. Vivisection sacrifices a disturbed creature while drawing you 3 cards. Unblinking Observer helps you pay your disturbed costs. Gavity Trapper and Scab Wrangler tap down the few flying blockers your opponents may have. And if you didn't get enough disturbed creatures, you can round out your flying package with Soulguide Gryff, Nebelgast Intruder, or Stormrider Spirit. Seriously, there are so many cards for this deck, it shouldn't be hard to put together. Decayed is a new mechanic that makes a creature unable to block, and it sacrifices itself after its first attack. While the mechanic itself is strictly a downside, the benefit of it is that it allows you to get these creatures at bargain bin prices. For example, Winddrake and Mindrot are fine but unexciting commons that often get a small bonus tacked on in Premier sets. Well, in this set, that small bonus is a 2/2 Decayed zombie token. Decayed is the blue-black zombie theme. Because you only get 1 attack with your Decayed tokens, this archetype is built around finding the perfect time to attack with them. You can either pressure your opponent's life total by attacking when they can only block with 2 toughness creatures, forcing them to take 2 damage, or trade with your creature that was going to die anyway. Do this enough, and eventually they'll have to start making poor blocks. Alternatively, you can play it slow and build up your zombie horde to the point that you overwhelm your opponent's life all at once. It doesn't take brains to understand why you might join the zombie horde. Jadar provides you with a steady stream of tokens. Ghoulish Procession recycles your non-token creatures. Blade-Stitched Scab lets all your tokens deal an additional damage before disappearing forever. Champion of the Perished grows larger with each token you create. And Corpse Cobble. This is the big one. You can attack with all your zombies, and as an instant during the end of combat step, after they've dealt their damage but before you have sacrificed them to their decay triggers, you can sacrifice them to Corpse Cobble to turn them all into one giant zombie that doesn't decay. And it has Flashback. Now, while you're waiting for the right time to attack, you want to find other uses for your zombie horde. You can tap them to fuel Larder Zombie, Scab Wrangler, or Siege Zombie, and anything that says sacrifice a creature is open season for you. When you do decide to attack, Bladebrand and Covert Cut Purse are excellent. Often, your zombie tokens will be chump attacking anyhow, so your opponent won't necessarily expect you to be able to finish off their blockers. And each time one of your zombies decays, Dreadhound, Morbid Opportunist, or Necrosynthesis will be right there to pay you off. But if you become too attached to your zombies and would rather they stay alive, Sludge Monster or Poppet Stitcher can remove their decay. Or you can just make new friends by using Crawl from the Cellar to buy back your Falcon Abomination or Diagraph Horde. With the vampire set looming on the horizon, they don't get their own mechanic in Midnight Hunt. However, the black-red vampires still have a singular focus, dealing damage to the opponent. But Who am I kidding? This archetype is pretty minimal, probably not even worth mentioning. Ow! What are you... Florian is the greatest. If he graces you with his presence, you must assist him in expanding his bloodline. Among his many fine qualities are First Strike, which makes him hard to block, and Impulse Draw. However, he's very busy, so he may instead send his emissary Vampire Socialite, who has evasion and pumps your other vampires, or Stromkirk Blood Thief, who makes your creatures just keep snowballing. As usual, this theme of dealing damage leads Black-Red to being a more aggressive color combination. If you can get on the board early and pressure your opponent's life total, you can ensure they keep losing life to keep powering up your creatures. To make this deck work, you're going to want to run a lot of cheap, aggressive bodies and keep your curve pretty low to the ground. Famished Foragers lets you unload your hand even quicker and turn excess lands into spells. Blood Pact also keeps your hand stocked, or can finish off a low life total opponent. Shady Traveler, Brimstone Vandal, and Hungry for More are hard to block, letting you deal damage even when the opponent has creatures. And you can deal direct damage with Siege Zombie, Neonate's Rush, Thermo Alchemist, or Strangling Grasp. There's not much else to say about this archetype. Just remember that, as with all aggro decks, pump spells can be even better than removal. We've reached the feature archetype of this set. Midnight Hunt is all about werewolves, and the red-green werewolves have received their own mechanic. The day-night cycle is a game state that you keep track of the moment a card causes it to become day or night, or when a day-bound permanent enters the battlefield. When it's day, all permanents with the day-bound-nightbound mechanic are transformed to their day-bound face. While it's day, if a player casts no spells during their own turn, it becomes night as the next turn begins. When it's night, all permanents with the day-bound-nightbound mechanic are transformed to their nightbound face, and such permanents enter the battlefield on that face. While it's night, if a player casts 2 or more spells during their own turn, it becomes day as the next turn begins. Every single red or green werewolf in this set is strictly better on the night side, which means that you want it to be Eternal Night. This deck's strength comes from the fact that its creatures are just massive compared to everyone else's. I mean, its commons are a 6/5 for 4, a 4/4 trample for 3, a 3/5 reach for 3, and a 6/6 vigilance for 5. Unless your opponent is rocking an absurd number of unconditional kill spells, all you need to do is draft a bunch of werewolves, make it nighttime, and turn them sideways. However, your opponent has an opportunity to stop you. When you skip casting spells on your turn, it becomes night on the opponent's turn. Then, if they immediately play 2 spells, it flips back to day on your turn and you still haven't gotten to attack with your nighttime werewolves. This turns the Magic game into a sub-game of who can keep the time of day in their favor. Your advantage is that it's easier to cast 0 spells than to cast 2 spells. Your disadvantage is that your opponent is casting spells to influence the board while you are not. There are a few ways to work around this disadvantage. Instant speed effects like Bounding Wolf, Clear Shot, Burn the Accursed, or Arlen's Plus ability can affect the board on the opponent's turn, which uses your mana while still allowing you to make it nighttime. You could also dump your mana into Hound Tamer, Lamholt Harrier, and Fangblade Brigand, which isn't as good as playing spells, but better than nothing. And of course, Unnatural Moonrise is an incredible card for this archetype, forcibly turning it to night on your own turn and potentially recycling itself. Last thing to note is that Curse of Shaken Faith punishes your opponents for making it daytime. This seems like a pretty weak card overall, but if it goes anywhere, it goes in this deck. Green-White Humans also gets a new mechanic in Coven, which is an ability word that is active while you control 3 or more creatures with different powers. Obviously, this is a go-wide theme, so you want to prioritize creature spells and tokens. You might feel the call of the Coven if you've drafted Augur of Autumn, Sigarda, Catilda, or Intrepid Adversary. Once you've joined the circle, the first thing you want to do is make sure you have plenty of creatures. You can create multiple bodies with Adeline, Clarion Cathars, Dawnheart Mentor, Tovalar's Huntmaster, or Join the Dance. Then you can give +1/+1 counters to your creatures to ensure that they all have different powers. Gavany Silversmith, Contortionist Troop, Defend the Celestis, Hound Tamer, and Timberland Guide are all great options for this. Gavany Dawnguard and Rite of Harmony keep the creatures flowing. Gavany Trapper is a cheap 0-power creature with an excellent ability, and if members of your circle keep dying, you can at least benefit from it with Unruly Mob or Odric's Outrider. Once you have enough creatures, you can turn them all into murder machines using Ritual of Hope or Dawnheart Wardens. Now, with all the human tokens in white and zombie tokens in black, you might expect Midnight Hunt's white-black archetype to be Sacrifice. And you would be right, good guess. Flesh Taker pulls double duty as our Signpost Aristocrat and the newest addition to my nightmares. Ghoulish Procession turns your dead non-token creatures into undead creature tokens, and Lisa likes to bring back your creatures so you can tear them apart again. We've already talked about ways to get tokens in blue-black and green-white, and those same cards are good here. However, Sacrifice decks can also benefit from playing creatures with Enters the Battlefield or Death triggers. Whichever creatures you're using, once you have them, you want to exploit them. Well, not the mechanic, that's not in this set. You know what I mean. Sacrifice is the obvious method. Eaten Alive and Rite of Oblivion turn your creatures into cheap removal. Or you can build a beater with Moorcrupt Behemoth and Ecstatic Awakener. As with most archetypes in this set, I suggest playing cards that benefit from creatures dying. Jaren or Dreadhound can drain your opponent's life total. Odric's Outrider, Necrosynthesis, or Unruly Mob pump your creatures. And finally, Bereaved Survivor and Morbid Opportunist provide card advantage. We've reached the first archetype in this set that is not heavily creature-focused. Blue-Red is all about instants and sorceries. Now, there are two ways to play this archetype. The primary method is slow and controlling. There are a lot of payoffs for this. Poppet Stitcher builds a zombie army, Vadrik makes all your spells much cheaper, Smoldering Egg blocks early, then turns into a dragon and kills your opponent quickly, Geistflame Reservoir builds up counters and turns them into damage, and it can impulse draw in the meantime. Leer gives your instants and sorceries flashback, Thermo Alchemist blocks and pings your opponent down over time, and Seize the Storm is both a spell and a creature that can threaten to win the game on its own. That's a lot of payoffs, and most of them are permanents, so we need to fill the deck with a lot of other spells. Counterspells like Devious Cover-Up and Dissipate keep your opponent in check while you build up to your grand plans. Electric Revelation, Secrets of the Key, and Arcane Infusion churn through your deck, helping find your payoffs. Removal spells like Revenge of the Drowned, Cathartic Pyre, or Light Up the Night keep your opponent from killing you too quickly. Consider cantrips, and can put flashback spells right into the graveyard, and Galvanic Iteration is great for copying any of the above. Of course, it is limited, so you still need a good number of creatures. Any old chump that trades off is decent, but consider prioritizing Ardent Elementalist to rebuy one of your old spells, or Unblinking Observer to ramp toward more expensive things. If you're playing a tempo-based spells deck, you want to get on the board early with creatures like Delver of Secrets, Festival Crasher, Spellrune Painter, or Brimstone Vandal. Then, just keep attacking every turn, removing any blockers your opponent might play with Fading Hope, Geistwave, Play with Fire, Abandon the Post, or Pax Betrayal. If you can't remove your opponent's creatures, combat tricks are the next best thing. Finally, it's important to have a little bit of late-game reach, and big flyers like Storm Skrillex or Stormrider Spirit can send in those last few points of damage. Black-Green's theme is a little hard to pin down. The Signpost Uncommons both care about how many creatures have died this turn, and the Signpost Rares both care about how many creature cards are in your graveyard. While these two mechanics can go hand in hand, they don't always. For example, yes, you can fill your graveyard by making sure a bunch of your own creatures die. But you could also fill it by self-milling with Dreadhound, Deathbonnet Sprout, Eccentric Farmer, or tapping at the window, which does not cause creatures to die. Similarly, killing a bunch of your own creatures can fill your graveyard, but it's a lot easier to make sure a lot of creatures die by attacking with Decayed tokens made by Diregraph Horde, Gisa, or Rotten Reunion, which doesn't put any more creature cards in your graveyard. You can mix and match these two themes in the same deck. After all, they have a lot of shared synergy, but it's important to be aware of the distinction and which cards help which theme. Other than that, the main thing you want to focus on is graveyard payoffs. Deathbonnet Hulk consumes creatures from graveyards to grow big and strong. Heirloom Mirror can stock your graveyard and, once flipped, do the same. Crawl from the Cellar and Dryad's Revival let you replay cards from your graveyard, and if you're playing any of these, Willowgeist gets pretty good. Conversely, Tarmogoyf gets pretty good if you're not removing cards from your graveyard. This archetype may not pull a lot of focus, but don't underestimate it. The strength of these Signpost cards can still make for a powerful deck in the right circumstances. Whereas Red-Green wants it to be Eternal Night, Red-White thinks time should flow naturally, and rewards you each time the day-night cycle changes. However, most of its cards are not Daybound and Nightbound. Instead, they make it day when they enter the battlefield, if it isn't already night or day. The main reasons to greet the day are Sunstreak Phoenix, a hard-to-kill flyer, Sunrise Cavalier, a trampler that gives out +1 counters like Shizopra, and Gavany Dawnguard, who draws you more and more creatures, although this guy is going to be pretty good in any white deck. These are all aggressive creatures, and the other cards in this theme are no different. Celestis Sanctifier and Obsessive Astronomer filter your card draw on decent bodies. Brimstone Vandal is hard to block and helps finish the game even when his stats are obsolete. And Brutal Cathar is an O-ring on one side and a painful to remove first striker on the other. Now your opponent is probably going to do their best to play exactly one spell every turn. This keeps the day-night cycle from changing and gives you no bonuses. So you are going to have to alternate between playing no spells and playing 2 spells. As with red-green, you can offset the cost of casting no spells on your turn with instant speed things like Cathar Commando, Loyal Gryph, or removal, or with activated abilities like those on Gavany Trapper, Famished Foragers, or Lamholt Harrier. If you can do this effectively, casting 2 spells in a turn becomes a breeze. After all, you often have an extra card you didn't play on your last turn, and as an aggressive deck, you're probably running a lot of cheap creatures like Voltaren Stinger, Falconwrath Perforator, and Sun Gold Sentinel, and cheap combat tricks like Flare of Faith, Raise the Effigy, and Lunar Frenzy. I do want to give a nod to Homestead Courage. This card is incredible here. For just 1 mana, you can scale up one of your small creatures to keep it from getting outclassed by blockers, then you have the rest of your mana to drop any other spell post-combat and make it daytime again. Lastly, the Celestis is not very aggressive, but it does let you change the day-night cycle at will, so it gives you some late-game reach. And of course, it's a mana sink for those daytime turns. Ah, remember original Innistrad? Blue-red Flashback was my very favorite archetype. Casting spells and casting them again. Well, guess what? It's back. Green-blue is host to the glorious return of Flashback. Do you really need me to give you reasons to get into this deck? It's Flashback. It gives you 2 spells on 1 card, which is straight-up card advantage. Of course, to offset this, the Flashback cost is often much more expensive, which means that to unlock the value, you need to build a late-game deck. To make this work, you want to play early creatures that trade off while giving you a bit of value. Eccentric Farmer and Organ Hoarder can draw a card while filling your graveyard, which as we mentioned before, is good because you're effectively drawing any Flashback cards you mill. Unblinking Observer can ramp for your Flashback spells, Dawnheart Rejuvenator ramps and stabilizes your life total, and Overwhelmed Archivist loots and gives you a second body to trade off with. In fact, most of the blue Disturb cards are worth playing here because they're good for trades, and payoffs like Phantom Carriage, Ominous Roost, and Willowgeist care about both. However, we also need to talk about Flashback spells. Shadowbeast Sighting and Rise of the Ants are probably the best ones, as they give you creature tokens that can help you trade off even harder, or finish the game if you finally run your opponent out of gas. Storm the Festival and Tapping at the Window can be good, but they require having a high amount of permanence, so they get worse the more instants and sorceries you're running. Dryad's Revival, Secrets of the Key, and Memory Deluge are of course great in the value engine that is green-blue ramp, but remember, you need less card draw in a deck that gets to cast its spells twice. Winterthorn Blessing is awesome, letting you turn the corner from defense to offense at a moment's notice. Path to the Festival is pretty decent, because it ramps you up to those big Flashback costs, and it's interesting because it encourages you to splash. As usual, green-blue is the best color pair for splashing. I know gold rares are tempting, but Croaking Counterpart is bad unless you have several creatures with very good abilities. There are a few more support cards worth mentioning. Drownyard Amalgam mills you, and can turn from defensive to aggressive as needed, finishing up the game even during a board stall. If you're milling yourself a lot, Slogurk is an excellent inclusion, and since you'll be building up a lot of mana for the late game, mana sinks like Triskaidekaphile perform great. In addition to the major archetypes, there are always a few build-arounds that take you in a different direction. Sigarda's Splendor lets you draw an extra card each turn if you have more or the same amount of life as you did last turn. While this is in play, your opponent is going to do their best to hit you at least a little bit each turn. You can offset this by walling up with Beloved Beggar or Bird Admirer, and you can gain life with cards like Lunarch Veteran, Turn the Earth, or Dawnheart Rejuvenator. Jaren gives you this little minigame where he can both lose and gain you life, and you have to finagle it perfectly so that you have 13, and then he transforms into Ormondal. He's mostly a complete package, but if you need a little help, you can lose life with Blood Pact or Infernal Grasp, or gain life with the same things as Sigarda's Splendor. Curse of Surveillance draws you a card on each of your opponent's turns for each curse attached to them. Honestly, this card is fine by itself, obviously better in a controlling deck. Don't worry too hard about trying to find other curses. There are only 3 others in the set, and they're all rare. And the only one of those worth playing is Curse of Leeches, which also plays well in a slow deck. And lastly, Moonveil Regent looks like an awesome build-around, until you realize that it's much better in an aggressive red deck than just trying to draft a bunch of random gold cards. Finally, I'd like to talk about the best commons in each color, just looking at the cards in a vacuum and not taking into account which archetype you may be trying to play. This is helpful if you aren't sure where your deck is heading, so you can simply choose one of the best cards in your color, as these are usually solid no matter which type of deck you end up playing. Our number 3 common for white is Morning Patrol. It's just a solid body that draws you a flyer when it dies. Number 2 is Gavany Trapper, because manipulating combat is consistently useful. And Candle Trap is a 1-mana pacifism, earning it our number 1 spot. Sure, it still lets their creature block, but most of the time, that's not a big deal. Removal's good. Blue's removal is slightly worse. Locked in the Cemetery is number 3 because it doesn't always tap down the enchanted creature. Gale Drifter is 2 flyers stapled together, which, as I mentioned, is kinda good. And Oregon Hoarder straight up draws you a card and mills 2, which is useful with like half the cards in the set. As I said, removal's good. That's why it's both number 3 and number 1 on Black's list. Number 2 is Diregraph Horde, because there are so many good ways to put those zombie tokens to use. Red's number 3 is Ardent Elementalist. This guy lets you buy back a spell from your graveyard, which is the kind of 2-for-1 I'm looking for. Brimstone Vandal is one of the quickest ways to dish out damage, if that's what you're into. And number 1 is Moonrager's Slash, because it can take out small targets at an efficient cost. Duel for Dominance is our number 3 common for green, because instant speed fight spells are great in response to removal, or on the opponent's turn after flipping your werewolf into a massive beater. Speaking of, Tireless Hunter is a big vigilance creature, which can be more powerful than it seems, and it can even get bigger. But the best green common is easily Shadow Beast Sighting. This gives you 2 4/4s, the first one on curve and the second one during top deck mode. And as always, don't be afraid to spend a pick on Evolving Wilds. This card is low cost, medium reward, consistently improving your mana unless you're extremely aggressive. Innistrad is my favorite plane, and I am so excited to be back. I'm looking forward to playing with the new Werewolves, making more tokens with less effort, and trying unsuccessfully to win with Triska Decaphile. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give us a like, and if you want to see more draft guides like this in the future, remember to subscribe. I just don't get it. If it's called Morning Patrol, why doesn't it have the day-night mechanic?